So let's have a couple of examples of close combat, and we'll start out with this fairly simple one. Let's assume that the German unit in the woods is a regular formation. It's got an attached mortar and a Panzer II company. It's being attacked by a veteran British battalion which has got an attached heavy machine gun. Now the first thing to do is to move into contact and take closing fire. So we start out with the Germans. This is the movement phase, remember, and the British have said they're going to move into contact. So the Germans can now take opportunity fire, and they can do that because the British are moving at least half their move inside the Germans' arc of fire. In fact, they're moving all of it. And also the British will not be an eligible target during the fire phase, and the reason for that is that they will then be in contact, and once units are in close combat, nobody can fire into or out of the melee. So the Germans get to fire, and let's adjudicate that. So the Germans are regulars, so they roll a d10. The modifiers, they have a mortar company which is worth a +1. The tank company, because it's a 20mm gun, is worth another +1. But there's a -1 for the target having moved. So overall that's a +1 on the German die. The British, as infantry in the open, are the most vulnerable possible. Their cover die will just be a d4. So let's roll that. Okay, so the Germans have rolled 8, and that's +1 makes 9. The British had a cover die of 3, but that means that the Germans have tripled them, which means that they will get 3 disorder marks. So that immediately means that they are suppressed, and they also have to take a morale test. We can tell immediately that this combat isn't going to go any further because a suppressed unit cannot move into close combat. But just for the sake of it, let's take the morale test. So the British are veterans, so they roll a d10. I was assuming they had 2 decorated leaders, although we hadn't got to the point where those would be relevant in close combat. But that will give them a +2. Let's see, anything else? I don't think so. So +2 on a d10. So they roll a 4, which means they will add an extra disorder mark. So the British will stop where they are because they are suppressed and therefore cannot enter close combat, and they will wind up with 4 disorder marks, which they'll have to start rallying off in the next movement phase. Remember, this all took place during the movement phase. The rallying off of disorder markers had already happened, so the British will have to wait until the next turn before they can remove any of those markers. So let's try again so we can get to the actual combat, close combat mechanics. So we'll assume the same battalion has rallied completely, removed its disorder, and is coming back for another go. So once again, it's the movement phase, the British trying to move into contact, and the Germans firing opportunity fire, and as before, they will have a +1 on their d10, and the British will be rolling a d4 for their cover die. And this time, the Germans have 4 + 1 is 5, the British have a cover die of 2, which means that they just take 2 disorder markers. And that means that they are not suppressed, and therefore they can move into contact. As I said a moment ago, this is happening in the movement phase. The removal of disorder markers has already happened for this turn, so the British will be taking those 2 disorder markers into the actual close combat. So let's move them into place. And then we can go and have a look at the actual mechanics using the close combat table. Right, so let's get down to the details, and we now have the tables in front of us. So just to recapitulate, we've got a veteran British battalion with a HMG attachment and 2 decorated leaders who already picked up 2 disorder markers, attacking a regular German battalion with mortars and a Panzer II attachment, and the fighting is taking place in medium woods. So let's take a look at the British first. They are veterans facing a regular opponent, so they start off in the 4th column with a C, but then we have to do some shifts. So they are facing the Panzer IIs, so they shift 1 column to the left, and they're also fighting in medium cover. so that's another column shift to the left, and so there the British wind up in the second column with the letter D. Now the Germans are regulars facing veterans, so they start off in column 3. Again, they have a letter D, but they also have some left shifts. They are facing an HMG attachment, so there's a column shift left for that, and they are also fighting in medium cover, which reduces their effectiveness a bit, so they have also 2 column shifts, and that takes them across to the first column with a letter E. So those are the basic disorder letters, but we now have to take the leadership role to see who actually wins the fight, this round of the fight anyway. So looking at the modifiers for the leadership role, bottom right, the British have 2 decorated leaders, so they get a +2, and they also get another +1 for being British. Similarly, the Germans get a +1 for being German, but they don't have any decorated leaders. So the Germans have a net +1 modifier, the British have a +3, and each side then rolls a d6. Okay, and the Germans rolled a 4, the British a 3. But with the modifiers, that actually means that the British have scored 6, the Germans 5, and therefore the British are the winners of this round. So the British stay where they are, they remain in place, and they take the 3 disorder markers because the Germans have a letter E. I should mention that the Germans ought to shift another one left for being the losers, but you can't shift left beyond the first column, so the Germans stay where they are with that E and inflict 3 disorder markers on the British. The British do not shift because they won the fight, and so their letter remains as a D, which represents 4 disorder markers. So we now have a look at the outcome and the effects. As I've said, the winners stay where they are. The British have now got 5 disorder markers, so they're suppressed, but no more. The Germans have 4. Now, in the fight, the Germans took more disorder markers, but they weren't doubled, so they don't automatically panic and fall back. They become suppressed, but they're suppressed anyway because they've got 4 disorder markers, and they have to take a morale test to stay in the fight. So the Germans are regular, so they take a morale test on a D10. They've got +1 for being in cover, and the only other adjustments are for the disorder markers, so they're on -4 for those 4 disorder markers they've just taken, which means they've got a net -3 on their roll. So let's roll a D10, and they score a 6, which goes down to a 3, and a 3 on the morale results table is add 2 disorder markers. Now I should say that the rules say that you have to pass a morale test to stay in the fight. It's not quite clear what they mean by passing. My interpretation of that is that if you take a morale test and are forced to fall back, in other words if you score a 2 or lower, then that's failing in these terms and you're out of the fight. If you score a 3 or higher, even if you take 1 or 2 disorder markers, you've still passed the test as far as staying in the fight is concerned. That's how I play it anyway. There's no other clarification in the rules that said what they mean by failing a test. So the Germans also stay in the fights. They've taken 2 more disorder markers, so they now have 6, and that means they are fragmented. So the Germans will be at even more of a disadvantage in the fight as it continues, although not such a major change as you might think, as we'll see in a moment. So both sides have stayed where they are, so the fight continues, and all close combats are fought to a finish within the turn, so we move on to another combat round. So again, looking at the table, the British veterans against regulars start in column 4, and they have the same column shift for facing an AFV, and a column shift for being in medium cover, and they also have a column shift now for being suppressed. So the British slides all the way across to the leftmost column, and they have a letter E. The Germans, again, they are facing an HMG and they're fighting in medium cover, so there's 2 column shifts. They also should have 2 more for being fragmented, but they can't go any further left. So as I said, being fragmented doesn't have such an impact as you might think. So both sides are firmly rooted in that left-hand column, and we move on to deciding who wins the round. And again, we have the modifiers to the leadership role, which are unchanged: 1 for the Germans for being German, 1 for the British for being British, and 2 for decorated leaders. So the British are +3, Germans +1. Roll a d6 for each side. And the British have scored a 5, the Germans a 1. So the British 8, Germans 2 after modifiers, which means the British have clearly won again. The Germans again should shift left for having lost, but they can't because they're in the leftmost column. So both sides inflict 3 disorder markers on each other. So actually both sides are now fragmented. The British have got 8, the Germans 9. But the British again have won the fight, so they do not need to do anything to stay where they are. The Germans do. They weren't doubled, but both sides took 3 disorder markers, so the Germans are not automatically panicked, but they have to take a morale test to stay in the fight. And of course now they are in big trouble, because they have 9 disorder markers, which means a -9 modifier to the morale roll. They still get +1 for being in cover, but that means they've got a -8 on their morale. They're rolling a d10 because they are regulars, so and they got quite a good roll, an 8, but to no avail. In fact, I think it's automatically a panic, whatever happened. So 8 minus 8 is 0, which means they panic. They fall back a minimum of 4 inches, or into cover if there's cover within 8 inches. They take 4 more disorder markers, which means they've reached 13, which means there's no risk of them being picked up for reaching 15 in close combat. But they have clearly lost the fight. They've fallen back. They've got a whole bunch of disorder markers, and they will probably have to retreat from the field, or certainly retreat substantially to regroup. The British have taken the wood. They have successfully assaulted the German positions, thrown them out, and although they have substantial number of disorder markers, 8, then as long as they're not immediately counter-attacked, then they will be able to hold their position for a couple of turns and rally off quite a bit of that disorder. Remember, they've got two decorated leaders in that platoon, and they are veterans, so they will be removing 4 disorder markers if they can stay still in cover each turn. So 2 turns and they'll be back to fighting fitness, which is one reason why, of course, the Germans will want to try and mount a counter-attack as soon as possible to throw them out of the positions they've taken before they can establish themselves, and that's a very familiar theme in all the history books that we read. If a unit takes a position and you can hold that position for a while, a couple of turns, it'd be an hour or so, then you've got a much better chance of holding on to it. So there's an example of close combat. I think it's probably shown up most of the different mechanisms, and the only thing I would say is it's probably slightly unusual in having an unsupported infantry unit attacking another one head on and actually succeeding. I hope that was useful.